Agent Turbett, how much time did you spend with them?
That was 2 hours and 20 minutes, and then we had some additional conversation, some other things beyond that.
In your training and experience, are you taught to look for things to see if the person you're dealing with is under the influence of anything?
Yes.
During your interview with the defendant, did you feel that he was under the influence of anything at that time?
Not at all.
Was he coherent and tracking the things that you said?
Yes, he would correct me if I misstated something, didn't ask me to repeat questions that I recall. Seemed to be tracking and answering appropriately.
Now, let's go back through a few things from that interview. I talked quite a bit about the defendant's job, and you had asked him why he took that job in particular. What did he say?
He said he took the job at Nugent Nuggets in May of 2017 because he thought it was time for him to be at home more with his family, and that job would allow him to do that.
In fact, he said that the job allowed him to be home every day, every night with his family, correct?
Yes, he said it allowed him to be home every day with his family.
Did he even go into an explanation about the sacrifice he made to do so?
He volunteered that taking that job was a sacrifice, that he made less money, but that would allow his family to spend more time together, so he was willing to do that.
Did he ever, during your interview, give the impression or state that in fact, he told you that he had a fairly set schedule, correct?
Yes.
What did he say?
As best our conversation went, he described sleeping typically from, he said, about 7 to 11 in the morning. He would get up, he would spend time with his family, he may take a nap, he would eat meals, and then he would go into work later that afternoon or evening.
And then typically come home in the early morning hours, correct?
Yes.
Now, you and the defendant also talked about WIC. What is WIC?
WIC stands for Women, Infants, and Children. It's a nutritional supplement program.
It's for families with children that may need some assistance, correct?
Yes. That they had made use of that at different points, and he was familiar with how it worked.
And he specifically stated you could use WIC to buy formula and other things, correct? WIC to buy formula and other things, correct?
Yes.
He also stated that WIC was available to them for Sterling, correct?
Yes.
What did he say about that?
When I asked him if that's something they had used with Sterling, he said that they had not used much of it. He thought that they'd gone in for a visit with a doctor. He explained that it required periodic visits with a doctor for the WIC benefits to continue, and that's something that they chose not to do. They chose not to go to the WIC doctor visits.
Through your investigation, did you look into that a little bit further regarding the WIC benefits?
I had called in to the agency that handles the WIC benefits and inquired as to whether they had used those benefits.
And what did you find out?
I don't think they were able to say at the time. I think I was told they weren't able to tell me if Cheyenne or the children had used the WIC benefits.
During the interview, the defendant never in any way stated that Sterling had any medical issues, did he?
No, other than when he was initially born, there was a little bit of water in his lungs that was quickly cleared up.
And it was clear that that had not been an issue since then.
He told me it had not been an issue.
In fact, he said Sterling ate like a horse, is that right?
Yes, he said he was good and healthy and ate like a horse.
What was it he told you about how Sterling alerted to them if he wanted food?
He described how, in his experience, typically a baby would fuss around when they were hungry, but Sterling had figured out that if he yelled, and he called it a yell, not a cry, he said when Sterling would yell, that would get him food quickly.
Did you ask him if you could hear that yell anywhere in the apartment?
Yes, we discussed that for a couple minutes. I pointed to some areas on his sketch and asked if he could hear Sterling's yell at different points in the apartment, and he said, oh yes. He assured me that he could hear the yell anywhere in the apartment.
Throughout the interview, the defendant, although admittedly didn't change diapers much or do the feeding, he seemed fully aware of what was needed to care for Sterling, correct?
Yes.
Walk us through what the defendant said about his interactions with Sterling the day before and the morning of that Sterling was found.
He told me that he would hold him and play with him on a daily basis, and he said on that day in particular, he had gone into Sterling's room, and he said that he was good and alert and wanted to play, so he had played with Sterling in that room.
And we're talking about the day before 911 was called, correct?
Yes, the day before he went to work.
Did he say that Sterling was responding to him?
Yeah, he said he was good and wanted to play, and he said that they had played around a little bit, and he described for me how Sterling was he was playing with his hands. He told me at one point how Sterling had a very strong grip.
Said Sterling was grabbing his fingers, right?
Grabbing his fingers when they were playing.
What did he say about, besides playing with Sterling that day, he was home most of that day, correct? The day before 911 came?
Yes, he said he didn't leave the apartment all day. He was with his family all day.
Went to work around 5 or so?
Yes.
And when did he say he came home?
About 4:45 that next morning.
What did he say about when he came home?
He said he came home and he made a little too much noise, thought that had stirred Nala. She got up, Cheyenne had gotten up, they had a meal together, made grilled cheese sandwiches. He was up for approximately an hour.
And that was the defendant, Cheyenne, and Nala.
Yes.
And after they ate, what did he do?
He said after eating, he had laid in bed and had played games on his cell phone until he started to drift to sleep around 6 a.m.
Now, prior to him going to sleep, did he say anything that he heard from Sterling?
He said Sterling had cried out and that he heard and that Cheyenne had gotten up to give him a bottle.
So he stated on the morning that 911 was called that he heard Sterling cry and that Cheyenne fed him.
Yes.
And again, the defendant was clear in the interview that Cheyenne did most of the diaper changing and the feeding, correct?
I think he said that Cheyenne did all of the diaper changing and most of the feeding. He said he would give some bottles, but she did most of the feeding.
He said he didn't like to change diapers.
He did not like to change diapers.
But he was able to tell you how much formula was used for Sterling's bottle.
Yes, he talked about a 4-ounce bottle, talked about how they'd switched from one formula to the next, and that typically he would take 2 4-ounce bottles in a regular feed.
During the interview, did you ever get a response from him? That gave you the impression that he was just completely absent from that home?
No.
Did you ever get a response that indicated that he wasn't in the home on a daily basis?
No.
He also talked to you about his belief in the strong sense of family structure. Is that right?
Yes, he talked about his upbringing and how his parents had raised him, and his Mennonite beliefs were still part of who he was.
Said it was important to him to have 3 meals a day together as a family.
He'd been raised that was very important, and He said 3 was good, at least 1 was very important.
And gave the impression that that's what they did, correct?
Yes.
What about Sterling's bedroom? Did he say how long Sterling had been in that back bedroom as Sterling's room?
He said about a month that had been designated as Sterling's room.
In your conversation with the defendant, did you have discussions about whether the pregnancy was planned?
Yes. He had said the pregnancy with Sterling was a surprise, but they had gotten through it.
When you were done with the defendant's interview, while you were still upstairs, or I guess I didn't ask you, where were you at in the sheriff's office talking to him?
It's right in the front lobby. You go up a set of stairs, and up at the top of the stairs, there's an interview room.
While you were upstairs with him, speaking with him, did you at some point ask to look at his phone?
Yes.
And I'm not for sure, that may not have been on that particular recording, is that correct?
I don't think it was on that particular recording. It would have been in a conversation that followed shortly thereafter.
Now, you asked to look at his phone, but in fact, you had a warrant to seize his phone, correct?
Yes.
Right, so tell us how that all played out.
So while I was talking to the defendant, during that time, other officers had written and obtained a search warrant, which his phone was on. And so I was told at the end of that 2 hours and 20 minutes or so that the warrant was in fact there and that we would need to seize his phone. So I informed the defendant that I would have to take his phone.
And what was the response to that?
He was adamant that that would be an inconvenience because he would have family that would want to know what had happened, and also he would need to speak to his employer.
Did you try to accommodate that?
I did. I was sympathetic, and I recall speaking to other officers, and I said, I think we can stay inside the instructions of this warrant. Perhaps instead of what we would normally do, which was a computer examination of the phone, that I would try and accommodate him by doing what we would call a manual examination, where I would work through the phone and try and take photographs and video of things as I was looking at it.
So did you do that?
I started to.
And where was the defendant at when you started to do that?
We'd invited him to, I think at that point he was walking around outside, talking to people.
And you told him, give me a few minutes, I'm going to go look through the phone.
I told him I would do my best to try and return his phone. I would accommodate him if I could.
So when you start looking through the phone, did you change your mind about just doing a manual search?
I did.
Why?
I quickly saw a number of references to drug use and buying of drugs, and that was inconsistent with conversations we'd specifically had about those things. And at that point, I made a decision that if those inconsistencies were becoming quickly apparent, we would need to just do a thorough forensic examination with computers to see what else was on that phone and if there were other inconsistencies at that point.
Because during your interview, you asked him if he used drugs, correct?
Yes, we had a pretty lengthy conversation about drug use.
And his response in general?
That he had used marijuana a long time ago, was certainly not doing anything at this point because he didn't want to jeopardize his commercial driver's license, things like that. So he assured me that he had not had anything to do with that in recent times.
So going through the phone, you quickly saw that was not the case.
Yes.
Did you go tell the defendant that?
Yes, I went down and told him that we would have to, in fact, seize the phone and do a forensic examination at that point.
Did you do so?
Yes.
And what did you tell the defendant about it?
I told him at that point we would move as quickly as we could, but the phone would not be returned that day. That takes time. That's actually not done by our agency. We actually have to have that scheduled and done, and it takes some time to get on that schedule.
Now, following the defendant's interview, did you do anything further that night?
Yes.
What did you do?
After we were completed with talking to the defendant and Harris and taking care of those items at the sheriff's office, I then drove to the apartment in Alta Vista.
And just generally, what did you do at the apartment in Alta Vista?
So I put on gloves right away, entered the crime scene area, and at that point, Special Agent Teal and others who had already been processing the scene began to walk me through and give me a sense of what was going on there.
Now, we talked earlier, before you interviewed the defendant, you hadn't been to the scene, correct?
I had not. This was my first time.
Did you go to the back bedroom?
I did.
Did you notice a difference between the feel of the back bedroom and the rest of the apartment?
I was immediately aware of the noticeable temperature difference. It felt much warmer, very stuffy. It was uncomfortable back in that back room.
And the smell?
It smelled what I would have described as urine and feces, maybe some other things. But
In the days following, well, let me back up. You assisted in searching some of the apartment, correct?
yes,
You assisted in collecting Sterling and putting him in the body bag, correct?
yes.
In the days following, what did you do?
So in working with Chief Deputy Palo, we began to assess what had been done during that initial day, what needed to be done, assigning leads. We had to wait on the autopsy report. There were some follow-up interviews, follow-up search warrants for records that needed to be obtained. And then at some point, as reports are being put together by officers and others, that all has to be assembled into a case report.
Did you see the defendant again that week?
Yes,
When was that?
that would have been 2 days later. So I first talked to him on Wednesday. I would have seen him on that Friday, the 1st, September 1st.
Where did you see him at?
At the Osage Public Library, the parking lot.
Why were you there?
So at that point, I was advised that a warrant had been signed by a judge. We had an order that said I needed to take a DNA sample, what we refer to as a buccal swab, of the defendant and Harris as well. And I was told that they were scheduled to meet with a DHS worker in Osage. I had called DHS. I spoke to the worker who would be meeting them. I asked where that was going to happen and approximately what time. I advised the DHS worker that I had a warrant, that I was ordered to get a DNA sample, and that I would just wait in the parking lot, that she could handle whatever she needed to handle, and then I would speak to them separately and take care of the search warrant.
So tell us what happened.
So I got there, I waited in the lot, and at some point, the defendant and Harris were in the lot and in their vehicle, and as I started to approach, it appeared that they were going to try and just leave. They were going to drive away from me. They were trying to. And so I had tried to position myself and made a gesture with my hand. I told them they needed to stop and tried to explain to them that, in fact, I had a search warrant that had to be executed.
So what did you do then?
I was able to talk them out of the car, and I started to begin to explain and read to them the search warrant.
What was the defendant's demeanor during this interaction?
He was very belligerent. He immediately, as I'm trying to tell him what the judge has ordered me to do, he said, "Do you want some more of my effing saliva?" So I was trying to explain to him as best I could that needed to happen.
And I assume he didn't say that.
He did not. He said the word.
So this was a much different behavior on that day than it was the first day you talked to him, correct?
Totally different.
In fact, the first day when you listen to that audio, he's very friendly and talks about multiple things, kind of like you're at a coffee shop.
Yes, he was courteous.
All right, following that day, just in general, what other types of things were you doing?
So some of those things I'd mentioned, beginning to inquire about reports, put things together, and looking at what follow-up interviews, there was other people that needed to be talked to now that were becoming apparent to us. This is always the case, and so either I would assign some of those out, or Chief Deputy Palo took care of some of those, or I would go and personally do some of those interviews as well.
And at this point, is it fair to say that based on the unique nature of this case, mostly what was going on was waiting for the medical examiner's report, correct?
Yes.
All right, the medical examiner's report was received a few months later, correct?
Yes, it was completed on October 16th, 2017, but the practice of the medical examiner's office is to not email that. We always receive that in hard copy form, so there's a delay from the time the report is completed, but we would get that several days after.
Once you received that report, what did you do?
It was reviewed by the officers on the case and the prosecutor, and there was a decision then at that point that we would need to seek an arrest warrant for the defendant and Harris.
And did you do so?
Yes.
So the defendant and Cheyenne Harris were both arrested?
Yes.
And what were they charged with?
Child endangerment causing death and murder in the first degree.
Agent Turbett, the day you interviewed the defendant, is the defendant that you interviewed on that day that we listened to, is he present in the courtroom?
Yes, he is.
Could you point him out, please?
He's over here in the pink and white shirt.
The record would reflect that the witnesses identified the defendant.
So noted.
So to be clear, when you spoke with the defendant the day of the 911 call, August 30th, 2017, he was able to describe Sterling's speeding schedule.
Yes.
He was able to describe how much Sterling ate.
Yes.
He was able to describe how often Sterling would eat.
Yes.
He was able to say that he could hear Sterling anywhere in the apartment.
Yes.
He told you that Sterling would yell and cry out for food.
Yes.
He was able to tell you Sterling's sleep schedule.
Yes.
And he was not absent from that.
No.
That's all I have.
Thank you, Your Honor. Agent Turbett, on direct examination, pardon me, you talked about following up with Rick.
Yes.
When was it that you followed up with Rick?
I believe approximately a week after the initial call.
And they gave you information about this family receiving warrant?
I have to look at the report. My recollection is that I was told they could not provide that information.
Because of confidentiality concerns, correct?
Yes.
They could not provide any specific information about either Sterling or Ms. Harris, is that accurate?
I believe that's correct.
When you interviewed Mr. Koehn on August 30th, 2017, was that the first time you had met him?
Yes.
You described his demeanor as having emotional flatness. Would that be similar to a flat affect?
I've heard that term used before. I would just say there was just not a lot of emotion throughout that interview.
And when you interviewed him, he actually said, "I'm in complete shock," correct?
He did say those words.
And during the interview, I believe we heard him take a phone call where he spoke to someone else on the phone. Did he do that?
He took several phone calls, yes.
And the purpose of the interview, I believe, was to gather background information about Mr. Koehn.
Partially background, and then I wanted to speak to him about what had happened that day and the days preceding.
But you did gather some background information, right?
Yes.
And that included information about his education.
Yes.
And he had explained to you that he went to a Mennonite school, right?
A private Mennonite school, yes.
And he explained that his schooling his formal education ended at age 14, correct?
Yes, he said that was typical of the Mennonite schooling system, that they graduate their school at 14 after 8th grade.
And that he graduated without even a GED, right?
Yes.
And he explained to you that he started working at the age of 14?
He said he was gainfully employed at 14.
Do you have any information about whether, since he was 14 years old, Mr. Koehn ever obtained either a high school diploma or a GED?
Only that I'd asked him those questions.
And as you stated, you followed up about Sterling, so I want to focus on some of the things in the interview. It's a little bit hard to hear.
Over periods of hours and maybe days.
Section 7, you marked occipital lobe white matter, and I'll let you say the last.
So that's gliosis. So occipital lobe is the back of the brain. There's two big components of the brain. There's the gray matter, that's the outside, and that's very thin. You can almost think of that as the thinking portion of the brain. That's where all the neurons are. And then there's the white matter, which is the central portion of the brain. That can almost be thinking of the wires. So all the signals, or the thinking part of the brain is on the outside, and then there's all the wires of the white matter. If the brain is injured or insulted in any way, such as a period of lack of oxygen or injury, and the person survives for many days to weeks, much like we get a scar if we get a cut on our skin, the brain also can scar in a way, and that scarring we call gliosis. I don't know what causes gliosis. It's something that happened probably weeks ago, and we do know that Sterling was not born in a hospital, so we don't have good records of what actually happened during that birthing process. But we know that babies during the delivery process, especially if they're not under medical care, can have periods where there's going to be anoxia or not enough oxygen. So I think the most likely explanation for this older injury is birth-related.
And then the next section, number 8, tell us about that.
So it's a term called watery astrocytes in the basal ganglia. So deep within the brain, there's an area called the basal ganglia. And this is you can almost think of this as a switchboard of the brain where signals are being transmitted and sent to certain areas. In order to hold all these wires together, you need cells that just form the framework. They're almost like the fuse box to just hold the wires and fuses in place. These are called astrocytes. If a person has had some insult, we most commonly see this actually in people with liver disease, but you can also see it in people who have been insulted, such as from malnutrition. So some of the things that we see in people with chronic liver disease, those same chemicals can also occur in people who have had prolonged malnutrition. So I don't know exactly what caused this, but I suspect that these particular abnormalities, again, are malnutrition related.
You also note that there was a perforation of the stomach post-mortem. What significance does that have for you?
Well, my ability to see, was there anything in the stomach that I could measure to look for? Was there formula? Was there food? Was there anything else in the stomach? I wasn't able to do that. The significance that there was a perforation, we always worry about that, could this have been inflicted? I don't think that's not the way I interpreted this. If the body is starting to decompose, and the stomach is much more susceptible than the rest of the body because there's enzymes, there's acid in the stomach there to digest food. Once you die, your stomach then becomes much more susceptible to just basically the tissue basically starts to decompose, and there's just a perforation or an opening in that stomach.
So basically the stomach broke open.
It just broke open from just starting to decompose.
But that happens after death?
Yes.
Did that in any way assist you in helping to decide how long Sterling had been dead?
It certainly let me know that there had been a period of time, many hours as opposed to just a short period of time.
Good place to take a break. Well, I think I'm going to go to this approximately. Wait up.
All right.
So you keep that in motion. Going through some of the photographs from the autopsy with Dr. Klein. As we're going through these, if at any time we do a break, want to get some air, just take a break away from it, please get my attention and take that break, okay? Obviously, there's going to be any graphic nature, and I just want to make sure everyone's as comfortable as we can be under the circumstances, all right? Just a minute.
Just to be clear on a couple of things that, from what we've talked about, there's no indication anywhere from Sterling that there was any type of assaultive injury to him.
That's correct.
And when we talk about malnutrition and dehydration in an infant, infants are either breastfed or receive formula, correct?
Correct.
Or with the water and providing that to the child. What is it within that that affects the malnutrition and the dehydration?
Right. So formula has a certain amount of the right ratios of the various nutritional requirements of proteins, fats, and electrolytes to the sodium with the appropriate amount of water, so it's absorbed and provides the correct amount of each of those nutrients that's needed.
So it's the powder, the formula part that gives the nutrition,
Yes.
and the water that it's mixed with that hydrates our children.
Yes.
And is that why, doctors stress you have to mix it just like the bottle says, and just to make sure they're getting the right amounts?
That's correct, both for the right amounts and also so it's absorbed correctly.
You said a little bit earlier that you did look at other possibilities. Did you make an attempt to rule out any natural diseases that would have made him end up like this?
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Well, by doing the autopsy, part of the reasons for doing autopsies is to document normal anatomy as it is to document abnormal anatomy. So there were no anatomical things that can happen, such as obstructions in the bowels, twisting of the bowel. There was no heart defects that sometimes can cause children to not thrive correctly. There were no abnormalities of the brain that were genetic in nature or were structurally abnormal. And then we also did cultures, which means we send specimens to a laboratory to look for common reason why children don't thrive. Common reason why children don't thrive is from bacteria and parasites. Not so much in this country, but we went ahead and ruled those out.
So nothing natural that would have done this.
Yes, correct.
Now we have heard testimony that Sterling was born just a few weeks early. Did that have caused any of this?
In reviewing the medical records, the child was seen in the neonatal intensive care unit, was treated with antibiotics, but the child was, in the opinions of the doctors, doing well enough to be sent home, and so survived that delivery at home, and I think was appropriately treated. So that small amount of prematurity, I don't think had any bearing on Sterling's death.
And so you did look at Sterling's birth records from the hospital, correct?
Correct.
Nothing in there that stood out to you that was an issue?
No.
All right. We've talked about the 3 individual causes of death: dehydration, malnutrition, and infection from diaper rash. Could any one of those things in and of themselves cause this child's death?
Yes.
In this particular case, did the multitude of those 3 factors working together make this different?
I think each of them, like we said, each of them could independently have caused the death, and absolutely together would certainly make the death occur maybe sooner. But because they're all present and they all are related in some way, I think they're all important when we consider this case and what actually caused the death.
Are you able to say what came first, or does it matter?
I think the malnutrition is something that I think has been going on for quite some time. The dehydration, obviously we can survive longer without food than we can without water. So the malnutrition would probably come first, and then the dehydration would come, and then also the infection. There was a period of time that it took for that skin to break down, and from the time that the bacteria first starts to enter and when it really gets into the bloodstream, that can vary from maybe a couple of days to maybe several hours.
How quickly would you start seeing signs of distress in an infant from any one of these factors?
So the malnutrition, the thing that one may notice is the baby's energy level and their ability to interact, even things such as crying, which is a normal developmental thing that actually prompts caregivers to realize that the child needs something, whether it's they're hungry or they're uncomfortable or something's wrong. That may be one of the early things to have been affected by the malnutrition. Dehydration also can cause severe lethargy or real tiredness, low energy, inability to do those normal things that babies would do.
And the diaper rash, how quickly can it get that bad?
The simple answer, I don't know. Diaper rash can start to appear quite quickly within a day, but to get to that level, it would likely take several days, maybe up to a week to get to that level of diaper rash.
Let's just talk about the last 20 or so days of Sterling's life.
The malnutrition would show that the baby is just not gaining weight, but continuing to gain length. So just the features of the child would change over time. They would just start to look thinner. The interactions that you would start to see even at a couple of months old with the child, you just start to have some interaction, whether it's eye contact, following the hand, some of those early developmental things you may not notice. Obviously, when a child is not being fed as often, we expect a certain frequency of diaper changes. Those might actually get longer, or the amount of actual feces produced might be less. And I think those would be the major.
Is it fair to say that maybe initially more at the beginning, the child might be louder, wanting food, crying out, things like that, and then you would see a natural decline in that to the point where the child's just lethargic and not responding?
Yes.
What if somebody touched Sterling every day during that time frame? What if someone had picked him up during that time? What would he feel like to them?
So there's a number of things going on. The infection may be the one thing to focus on for the moment. When someone becomes infected, one of the early things that's going to happen is the person will develop a fever, so they would be very warm to the touch, and they would actually start to sweat, so they'd be very wet. And so, the classic is your mother putting her hand on your forehead to see if you have a fever. It's noticeable that you would have that fever. In Sterling's case, where he actually had what's called bacteremia, so the bloodstream was filled with bacteria, the E. coli that was originated from the feces that went through the skin and the diaper area. When you get to a certain level of infection, you can actually go into what's called sepsis. And you go through a fever stage, and then you can actually become hypothermic, where actually your temperature drops and you become actually cold. And that would be something that someone may notice, especially if you're in a warm room, that the person would actually start to feel cool.
And Sterling,
So what is going. What I look at is I say, we have a source of infection, we had infection in the blood. Most likely this person had sepsis with this degree of pathology.
what would this natural progression of Sterling's medical condition and the state that he was in, what would that smell like to the senses?
In Sterling's case, the diaper and the feces that were accumulated and decomposing, combined with the urine, would be, I think, the most noticeable thing. It would be a very noticeable, pungent, very noticeable, unpleasant smell. There would be both of stool and then it could even be almost like a sewage type of smell because it's decomposing feces.
And during the autopsy, you were subjected to that as well?
Yes.
What would the natural progression of his decline during this time frame sound like?
It would probably be silent. When children if they're sick, if they're dehydrated, and they're malnourished, the thing that their only real defense mechanism is making noise so that someone can help them. And that's one of the things that they lose in all three of these things.
So like we discussed earlier, that maybe at first when they still had the energy, more excessive.
That's correct.
This may sound like an odd question, but do infants have the same sensory feelings that we have? Can they feel pain and discomfort and things like that?
It's a difficult question. They certainly have all the nerves and they have the connections. Part of pain is your understanding of pain, but they certainly respond to when they're placed in uncomfortable position, when they are given vaccinations, when they don't feel well because they have congestion. We know that their cries are different. We know that they're what we would describe as unhappy. So they certainly are perceiving these stimuli which are unpleasant to them. How they intellectualize that, I think that's hard for us as adults to know, but they certainly are reacting differently when they have painful and uncomfortable stimuli versus when they are comfortable and well-fed.
So they have the natural basic sense of pain.
Yes.
At the minimum. So for Sterling in that position that he was in, what would the natural progression of his decline feel like for him? What's he feeling during that time?
Objection relevant.
Overruled.
If we take each of these differently, so the malnutrition as far as hunger is one of those major survival drives in humans. And so the hunger is going to be a feeling of discomfort to a child. They're going to respond by crying. And there's going to be this feeling that they may or may not understand, but it's going to respond in a verbal stimuli of crying. Dehydration is going to vary. There's still a thirst drive that people are going to have. That's one of the more powerful drives for survival, is to make sure that you have enough fluid. So there would be some stimuli. How that child understood that, I don't know, but that would be something that they would respond by crying. And then there is the infection component, which when we have a fever, that's a generally uncomfortable feeling. It's just they're going to respond to that by being cranky and irritable. And then finally, the rash. It's tender. It's going to be very painful for touching that area. As you start becoming more infected and you become more dehydrated, your ability to actually respond and have what your awareness of these various stimuli, I think, would probably decline over time.
Doctor, someone had claimed to be with Sterling on August 29th, the day before 911 was called, and said that Sterling looked healthy. Would you find that possible or probable?
Well, I can comment that the child, when I did the autopsy, and you will probably get to see the photos, and you'll be able to see that the child looks like it's malnourished. It's somewhat emaciated. It does not look like a baby that has been fed and starting to have sort of that chunky baby appearance that one usually interprets as a healthy baby. That's not the case. So that would be the first observation I think one could make. The other is just the odor, I think, would be based on what I saw at autopsy, that the feces were not fresh, that they had been there for a period of time, that just that day before, that was probably the same diaper with the same decomposing feces. That would have a very distinct odor that one would notice.
If someone said that Sterling on August 29th was interacting with them and grasping their finger or doing things like that, do you find that possible or probable?
There are possibilities that someone can, there are natural reflexes that babies have that when you put certain stimuli in. I think a normal interaction, though, as far as being able to make eye contact or follow your eye or have some sort of that engagement, given how dehydrated, malnourished, and infected the child was, I would expect the child would have been non-interactive with a person who's trying to interact with them.
Let's talk about time of death. We see on the TV shows that the medical examiner shows up at the scene and says, I think the time of death is at 11:52. Is that how it works?
No.
Okay. How does it work?
So there is no scientific test that can tell us exactly when someone dies. The only way you know exactly is if there's a doctor or nurse who is there at the time with a stethoscope or an EKG pad to tell you exactly when that person died. There are certain changes that occur after death that medical examiners use to give an estimate or a range of when the person may die. And the three classic things that people use are temperature, so you can actually feel the person. Are they warm? Are they cool? Are they actually cold? We use rigor mortis, which is the stiffening of muscles. So first, the body, right after it dies, there's going to be no rigor mortis. Then over a period of many hours, the rigor mortis gets more and more intense. It stays there for a period of time, and then it eventually releases. And then there's livor mortis, which is a settling of blood in the what we call the gravitationally dependent areas, and it slowly accumulates over time. So we use all those things to give an estimate in terms of within maybe 8 to 12 hours versus 24 to 36. And there are a number of assumptions that are all used with those. But again, they're just good guesses as to when a person died.
In this particular case, are you able to give an opinion as to the range of time that Sterling died?
I'm not able to give a definite time of death or even really a range.
All right, let's talk about the actual autopsy a little bit. Deputy Palo was here earlier and discussed with the jury about how he would set up Sterling's swing so you could see him in the position that he was when he was found. Is that right?
Yes.
Did that assist you in any way in making some determinations about this case?
Yes.
Tell us about that.
It allowed me to see the circumstances that Sterling was in at the time of his death and the place of his death.
Can you describe to the jury the general steps that you went through with Sterling in regards to this autopsy, where you started out and where you ended?
Sure. Really, we have a protocol that we follow, and we followed that protocol here. What we do is it's basically a layer-wise and stepwise process. So where we had the swing and the clothing and the blankets, we took them off in a layer-wise, examined them, and we do that the same way when we get to the body. We examine it, clothing, we examine it, we take pictures. We actually do an internal component of the body, looking at all the organs, weighing the organs and taking.
Prior to this, to being here today, did I ask you to pick out some photographs from the autopsy that you thought would be relevant and helpful for the jury to better understand your testimony?
Yes.
May I approach?
You ready?
I'm handing you exhibits 104 through 118. And if you could just, yes. Are those all photographs from your autopsy?
Yes.
This time the state would offer exhibits 104 through 118, or I'm sorry, 100 through 118.
Any objection?
Object for reasons previously stated.
Based on the previous ruling, you are admitted.
And doctor, it may be easier, other witnesses have stood up
Okay.
at the screen to point things out. Okay, the first picture that's going to come up, just so the jury knows.
Why would it be easier to have him on the other side?
Well, if he's going to face this way, I can hear him better, maybe. But if it's easier when he speaks up, shouldn't be a problem.
Yeah, would that be better?
Would that work better?
We just discussed this earlier yesterday with another witness, and it was hard with the back turned for her to hear sometimes.
I understand.
The first picture that's going to come up is a picture of the body bag. Is it fair to say that the photographs are just a natural progression through your autopsy?
Yes.
And in fact, we didn't include any photographs that involve looking at the inside of Sterling or anything like that.
That's correct.
And I have it up, states Exhibit 100. Tell us what that is.
So this is the body bag, and you can see this is a number and the date that the autopsy was done. There's a tag that seals the two zippers, so this shows us that the bag was not tampered with from the time from the scene to when it arrived at our office in time of autopsy.
On the screen, I have two photographs, Exhibit 101 and Exhibit 102, side by side. Talk to us about Exhibit 101.
So when we received Sterling, he was in the car seat, and this holder came separately. So what we wanted to do is see exactly, to reconstruct exactly the way it was in his residence. So that's what it looked like. This is a close-up. We haven't touched or done anything. You can see the blankets. You can see the clothing. You can see a little bit of this material coming out of the mouth. It's probably, it may be dry vomit, but it may also be what's called purged fluid, which is a normal. After death, sometimes there's fluids that leak out from the mouth and the lung area that come, and then it's dried.
Okay, so any blood, we have heard testimony that it appeared he had dried blood in his mouth. That wasn't from some type of assault. That was a natural effect of the death.
That's correct. Yeah, often purged fluid is often misinterpreted as blood.
You talked about the blanket in Exhibit 102. That was on top of Sterling, correct?
Yes.
Okay. I have up Exhibit 103. Tell us about this.
So this is the blanket. We laid the blanket out so you can see, and this was over the bottom portion of Sterling. So this just shows one of the blankets that was covering him.
Is that a child-sized blanket or a full-size blanket?
This is a fairly good-sized blanket. You can see here this is a 6-inch ruler. So we're talking, that's probably like 2 foot by 2 foot blanket.
Was it just folded up and set on top of them, or just kind of thrown in?
Kind of scrunched up and placed on top.
Exhibit 104, this is actually a close-up of Exhibit 103. What's the relevance of this?
So we took a close-up. Here's the ruler, and then you can see these white, these are maggots. So these were crawling on the blanket.
Where else did you observe maggots crawling?
So we saw maggots and puparia both on the covering that's normally in the car seat, and then we actually saw it on the onesie worn by Sterling.
You said puparia. What do you mean by that?
So in the life cycle of a fly, you have a fly comes and lays eggs. That egg develops into eventually larvae and then turns into puparia, which is sort of the life cycle changes of the fly. And so we saw various stages of the development of the maggot.
And you said you saw it in the car seat. Do you mean the swing seat?
That's right, yeah. The swing seat. Yes.
I now have up Exhibit 105 and 106. In Exhibit 105, it appears that you've taken the blanket off. Is that correct?
We've taken the blanket off. You can see that the strap is still in place on the Exhibit 105. You can see that there's some clothing that's stuffed in around the sides and the back of Sterling. Then in 106, we've taken the belt and splayed that open, so then you can see that there was some more clothing stuffed in around the diaper area. And then you can also appreciate the staining of both the pants and the onesie that are basically absorbing all the stool and urine and other secretions.
The blankets and things that you took off of Sterling, were they wet?
Yes.
Fair to say, this is the beginning of your autopsy, were you just taking things off layer by layer?
Layer by layer, yes.
Any of those layers that you took off, were they not wet or dirty?
They were all wet and had this, the absorption of all the feces and urine.
Doctor, can you also tell us, we've seen photos of Sterling where his little arms are out and his hands are clenched. Does that?
Eyes, whatever position they're in, as long as no one has moved them, that's the position they're going to stay. So at the time that Sterling died, his hands may have been clasped. There are various neurological responses that happen when a person dies, and some of those responses involve clenching and turning the arms and doing these different, what's called posturing. And those could have been going on at the time, but that's why his hands are in those positions.
There's 8 on the screen.
107, so we've removed Sterling now, and then you can see that there's this, I described it as a short sleeve, hooded type sweatshirt that was stuffed in and around the base area. Another just a loose article of clothing. And then there are also other articles of clothing. You can see here they're infant mittens, and there were 3 of those, and there was a sock. And then there were numerous other onesies, just loose onesies, 3 other loose onesies stuffed in and around Sterling.
In Exhibit 108, that's is that a shirt?
I described it as a short sleeve hooded sweatshirt. It had a zipper, so it's a little bit heavier cloth than the onesie material, but it's not like a jacket, so it would be like a spring type of sweatshirt type.
Is that an adult size or a child size?
Child size.
You say these things were just stuffed in and around. Did you see any purpose for that, or what was?
I didn't really see any purpose as far as providing any type of insulation. I was told that the room was actually quite warm, so I don't have any reason why that material would be stuffed in and around the body like that.
But those items were soaking up the feces in there?
Yes.
Exhibit 109, what are we looking at here?
So this shows, we laid out some of the different articles. So here's the 3. There's 2. There was a pair and then one other type of mitten. There was a sock. There were the other onesies. You can see part of the blanket and then this other sweatshirt. So this just shows the various articles that were stuffed in and around Sterling.
And Exhibit 110 and 111 are on the screen. What is 110?
So 110 is we've removed all those clothing. So now you can see that, again, this is the seat area. And you can see that there is a staining, and that's all the absorption of again, the feces and urine that soaked through the diaper and clothing into the seat area of the swing seat.
And Exhibit 111?
So 111 is this is the clothing that was worn, and we haven't removed it. You can see that there's obviously it's wet. It shows again that absorption, and you can see this gray sludge-like material. This is some of the decomposing feces material that's starting to leak outside the diaper into the outside of the clothing.
So that gray, almost triangle shape that we see on the onesie, that's feces.
Decomposing feces, yes.
How much did Sterling weigh at autopsy?
He weighed 3,152 grams, and that's just under 7 pounds.
picture that is coming up is going to be more of a close-up of Sterling's body. Exhibit 112, tell us what that is.
So this is the onesie that was actually worn, and you can see that there are maggots crawling on the clothing.
Could you see maggots on Sterling?
This directly on the skin, just on his clothing.
$113.
So this is the covering in the swing seat, and we talk about maggots, and then as maggots mature, before they actually become flies, they go through a puparia, and these are the puparia that we saw. So this is showing a different stage in the fly maggot life cycle.
Which tells you that those insects have been there for a while.
Yes.
Now I believe a picture will come up of a close-up of Sterling. So I have exhibits 114 and 115. Tell us about 114.
So 114 shows where the clothing has been removed and the diaper has just been displayed. And so we haven't cleaned the body, but you can see now the direct contact of the decomposing feces in contact with the skin. And what you'll notice is that there's this redness to the skin. That's the severe diaper rash. And so in making that connection of feces causing this rash, ultimately leading to an infection, here's what we see as the objective observation of feces causing irritation, sloughing, and diaper rash on the skin in the areas covered by the diaper.
Exhibit 115, what do we see there?
And this is just the reverse side. So we're seeing the Sterling's back and his buttocks, and you can see the concentration of the skin sloughing is right over the buttocks, and then the redness that you see is the irritation from being in that contact with that stool for prolonged periods of time.
Exhibit 116 and 117 are on the screen. What are we seeing in those?
So in this stage of the autopsy, what we've done is we've very carefully tried to clean the feces away so that you can actually see what the skin looks like. And normal skin you could use as a reference down lower parts of the leg. The abnormal skin, the dermatitis or diaper rash, is we see this redness. So that means all those superficial layers are eroded and sloughing away, and there's blood vessels there, and it's irritated. And then you can actually have major portions of skin sloughing you can see up around the tailbone area.
In Exhibit 116, we're seeing the front side of Sterling. At the top of the picture, is that his ribs?
So here is the rib cage right here. Here's the belly button. So it was coming up pretty much over a majority of the abdomen.
Would you also say that in being able to see the ribs as clearly as you do, that's part of that malnutrition as well?
That's correct.
In Exhibit 118, what is this a photo of?
So this gives you an idea of what could you observe by just looking at the child. And so you would see the child's face. What you can see here is that, again, a lot of the typical fat that's in around the cheeks is absent. The eyes are very dry. They almost had a bluish color, which I suspect is just from being so dried and dehydrated. You can sort of appreciate here, but I'll also describe it. There's the soft spots in a baby. These were actually sunken because of dehydration. I think that those are the major things that you can appreciate without having to do an autopsy or even removing any clothing. This is what you'd be able to see.
Is it fair to say when you looked at Sterling, being a doctor, did you just immediately say, this kid's malnourished?
Yeah, we know just from, one of the early things that we do is weigh the child, and then we can also just look at that soft spot. So I was immediately concerned that this was going to be a dehydration and malnutrition.
And we also, in this picture, we see I see some red marks on the neck. Does that mean anything to you?
This is what's called rigor mortis. So this is one of those three things that we use to estimate how long a person has died. So when you start to see this, it starts to appear maybe an hour, and it becomes more intense, and then actually becomes fixed over time. This is not a bruise, it's just a post-mortem change that we see.
You had talked about rigor. When the MEs, the medical examiner at the scene, investigator at the scene, he had put that rigor was 3 in the report. What did that mean to you when you read that?
So that means to me that that was 3 means it's full rigor. So it's gone through the chemical processes enough that the person was in full rigor. It indicates that the child did not die just a couple of hours before, that there had been some time that the child had been dead.
Okay. And when you say some time, do you mean a day or 5 days or?
So typically, rigor mortis in an adult who is not infected would develop full rigor mortis after about 8 hours. And the following 8 hours, it would remain in that full rigor. And then the following 8 hours would start to dissipate. Now, in a young child, that...
Are we doing the photograph? Let's take that down.
Okay.
I just don't think they need to put the photo on this screen.
So in a young child, all those processes tend to take less time. If a person has an infection and their body temperatures, because all these things are related to temperature, that also can shorten the amount of time. And then if the person is in a warm environment, so we typically say it's about 68 to 70 degrees when we use these estimations. I had information that the room was warmer, maybe closer to 80 degrees, 75 to 80 degrees. That would also hasten or lessen those amounts. So to give that exact time, but I suspect we're in full, the MAC, you would expect that to be about 8 to 12 hours in the normal person, but it may be less than that in this case.
May I approach?
You may.
I'm handing you State's Exhibit 99. What is that?
So this is it's a growth curve, and on it I've put both the weight and length measurements for Sterling, both the birth weight and what I measured at autopsy.
They would offer Exhibit 99.
Any objection to 99?
No objection.
Permission to publish?
Grant?
It's a little hard to see up on the TV, but I have Exhibit 99 up there. Is this a growth chart? You take your baby to the doctor and they start tracking growth? Is that what this is?
It's the same one, yes.
Okay. Tell us what you did with this growth chart.
So there are 2 curves here. This one is for weight, and this one is for length.
And for the record, the weight is on the bottom and the length is on the top.
Correct. The red marks indicate what were in the medical records at time of birth. And then the black marks indicate my measurements at time of autopsy. So you can see here let's take the weight, was right around 3, this is 3 kilograms. And then we move over 3 months, and then we can see we're just above 3 kilograms to 3.1 kilograms over the course of 3 months. His birth weight was right around in the 10 to 25th percentile. We would expect, if he remained on that curve, that he would be upwards of around 5 kilograms. So it would be roughly almost 11 pounds versus being just under 7 pounds. And then for the length, we can see he was 18 inches and then had grown. Now, he was definitely off or below the curve. We don't really know where he would have been because we only have 2 measurements. So ideally, you'd like to have pediatric visits in between here so you can see what their curve is going to be as an established growth rate.
And you had talked about, I have a son who's very short and always has been. So he's always been right at the bottom of the height chart. However, the moving up, so it's all okay and there's no problem. And that's exactly what you're not seeing when it comes to somewhat to the height, but mostly to the weight.
Correct. Like once you have a couple of points on here, what a doctor is going to look for, so we're following this curve, and then all of a sudden a child starts dropping, or it just doesn't do anything here, we know something is wrong. That's why you want to bring the baby to the doctor for those regular visits, so we can start getting some points on that curve so we can tell if something is wrong.
Doctor, at the beginning of your testimony, you said you look for a couple things, or you answer a couple of things: cause of death and manner of death. We have cause of death, malnutrition, dehydration, infection. Did you provide an opinion about the manner of death? And what is the manner of death?
Homicide.
Asking answers. Overruled.
Homicide.
And what do you base that opinion on?
I base it on my autopsy findings and the circumstances described to me surrounding the death.
And again, doctor, with a child this age, that child cannot survive without the assistance and care of other people, correct?
Correct.
I have no further questions.
Do they need a break? You need to go across?
Asking you about your determination of manner of death. Your testimony is that the manner of death is homicide, correct?
Correct.
And as used by you, the manner of death of homicide does not mean the same thing as murder, right?
That's correct.
In your use of the term, it is a medical term, correct?
Correct.
I'd like now to move to talking about dehydration. If it's okay with you, I'll just use the lay terms for that.
That's fine.
Children lose water more quickly than adults, correct?
Yes.
And that is one of the factors that makes it difficult to give a time frame for how long Sterling would have needed to be dehydrated.
Correct.
And the time that Sterling could have been dehydrated before it became fatal could vary anywhere from hours to days, right?
Correct.
Regarding the infection that you testified about, your opinion is that the infection itself would have taken many days to develop?
Yeah, I think that the amount of time from with no diaper rash to being infected probably would have taken days. From the amount of time once there was an established diaper rash to having actual bacteremia or bacteria in them, that would vary maybe from a day to, that could even happen in hours.
On direct examination, you talked about rigor being present when Sterling was found. Did you rely upon the preliminary medical examiner's report?
Yes.
And I just want to make it clear, it takes less time for rigor to develop in an infant than in an adult, correct?
Yes.
And in an adult, we're talking 8 to 12 hours after death before that sets in.
Correct.
But there were a couple of factors in Sterling's case that could have contributed to accelerating rigor, right?
Correct.
Those factors are the blood infection, right?
Yes.
And warmer temperature in the room,
Yes. That's correct.
And because of this, you're unable to give us an exact time of death for Charlie.
Correct.
You testified about the preliminary report of the Chickasaw County Medical Examiner. You reviewed that in coming to your determinations, correct?
Yes.
And that report reported to you the child had last been seen alive on August 29th by the mother, right?
That's what, yes,
At about 2000, which is about 8 o'clock p.m.
that's correct.
And is it possible that Sterling passed away on August 30th, 2017?
That's possible, yes.
Thank you, Doctor. I don't have any other questions.
Redirect.
Judge, can I just clarify with the court, exhibits 119 and 120, were those offered earlier and accepted?
One 119 and 120 have not been offered, nor has 122.
Dr. Klein, and I'm not showing these photographs to the jury. I'm going to give you exhibits 119, 20, 21, and 22. Are these also photographs that you took at your autopsy?
Yes, they are.
State would offer 1, 2.
I just want to be clear, I think there's not a 121, is that correct?
I don't have a 121.
There is a 121.
Okay, there's not one of them.
We can take care of that.
Well, I probably need to look at it before I admit it.
Oh, actually, Judge, it's, so you got the 121, so 119, 120, and 122.
There you go.
I just want to make sure. The reasons previously stated for defense objects.
Very good.
I don't have any questions.
I'll recross.
And this witness be excused. After you're on release.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Want to get started with your next witness, or just do them all at one time?
Okay, we can get started with them. It's up to the court as to whether we want to break now and come back and do them.
Well, we just take our break now and we'll come back at 1. It's just easy to do it that way. Ladies and gentlemen, continue to heed the admonition during the lunch break this evening.
All rise for the jury. I apologize, I forgot I left that blank because it was one that was already.
It's okay.
I wasn't trying to, I just want to make sure I
No,
was
I
on the page.
know, I know.
So how many times have you examined him? How many times have you examined him?
Dr. Klein?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's very polished.
And he's,
Yeah, I mean, he's just very...
We want
explains things very well. He's not arrogant, he's not above anybody.
All right.
And he seriously just, that's who he is.
Was he wasn't lectured?
No, we have made up. We have limits on lecture.
You didn't